The Ardennes forest, in December 1944, lay under a thick quilt of snow. Trees stood bare and silent, cloaked in white like ghostly sentinels. For weeks, this section of the Western Front had been calm, almost eerily so. Soldiers on both sides called it a ghost front, a quiet place to rest and regroup after the nightmarish meat grinder of the Hurtgen forest. The American units stationed here were exhausted. Some were green, just rotated in. Others, like the men of the 1st Infantry Division, the famed Big Red One, had seen too much war already. But even these hardened men were unprepared for what was to come. On the morning of December 16, 1944, at precisely 5:30 a.m., hell was unleashed. With a sound like rolling thunder crashing through the pines, over 1,600 German artillery pieces opened fire across an 85-mile stretch of the front. It was a massive coordinated barrage, the prelude to Adolf Hitler's final gamble. Trees exploded into splinters. Roads vanished under eruptions of earth. The sudden violence tore apart the silence and shattered the illusion of peace. As the shelling lifted, the horizon darkened again, not with clouds, but with movement. Out of the mist and the forests came the storm. Nearly 200,000 German troops supported by over 1,000 tanks and assault guns, including the fearsome Panther and Tiger tanks. These were no ordinary troops. The best of the German military, SS Panzer divisions, seasoned infantry, paratroopers trained for winter warfare, were thrown into this final roll of the dice. Hitler called it Operation Wacht am Rhein. The goal: break through the Allied lines, split the American and British forces, seize the port city of Antwerp, and force the Western Allies into a peace negotiation. If it succeeded, it could change the war. The American front line collapsed in places under the weight of the sudden assault. Entire regiments vanished in the snow. Communication lines were severed. Fog blanketed the region, grounding Allied air power. Panic spread like wildfire. Convoys of retreating GIs clogged narrow roads. Cold, dazed, and wounded men stumbled rearward, their eyes blank with shock. Some units fought to the death in frozen villages. Others surrendered, surrounded, and outgunned. And yet, even in this chaos, even as the German war machine surged westward, there were those who did not break. Among them stood the 1st Infantry Division, known as the Big Red One for the blood-red numeral emblazoned on their shoulder patch. These were not ordinary soldiers. They had stormed the beaches of North Africa in 1942, clawed through the hedgerows of Normandy, and fought through the hell of the Hurtgen. They were combat veterans to the bone, bruised, battle-weary, but unbroken. While the world would later focus on the surrounded paratroopers of the 101st Airborne at Bastogne, it was the 1st Infantry Division that was tasked with slamming the door shut on Hitler's bold offensive. Stationed in the northern shoulder of the Bulge near Elsenborn Ridge and Monschau, the Big Red One quickly grasped the scale of the German attack. Within hours, their regimental commanders began repositioning forces. The roads were thick with snow and ice. Vehicles skidded and stalled. Ammunition was short, but the orders were clear. Hold the line at all costs. Delay the enemy. Buy time for reinforcements. Deny Hitler the breakout he needed. In those first critical hours, the 1st Infantry Division dug in. Machine gunners and riflemen took up positions in frozen foxholes, their breath fogging in the sub-zero air. Mortarmen hauled rounds through knee-deep snow. Artillerymen lashed together makeshift gun emplacements on icy hillsides. Scouts crept through the woods, their eyes peeled for the glint of metal or the crunch of boots. And soon, the enemy came. They came through the trees, gray ghosts with machine guns and Panzerfausts. The opening battles were brutal and intimate, house to house in some towns, tree to tree in the forests. At Bullingen and Krinkelt-Rocherath, German units were shredded by American artillery. Tanks advanced, only to be picked off by bazooka teams firing from haylofts and cellars. The Big Red One held, and that was the difference, Because while Bastogne was surrounded and heroically defended, it was the 1st Infantry Division anchoring the northern shoulder of the German assault that bled the offensive dry. Their resistance prevented the Germans from expanding the Bulge to the north. They held the high ground. They held the road junctions. They delayed the enemy just enough for General Patton's Third Army to race north and relieve Bastogne. By the time the snow melted and the Bulge was no more, the cost had been staggering. 19,000 Americans killed, tens of thousands wounded or missing. But Hitler's last gamble had failed, and the Big Red One, battered but still standing, had played the decisive, if unsung, role in breaking the back of the Wehrmacht in the West. This was not just a tale of tactics and terrain. It was a story of men, of foxholes dug in frozen earth, of letters never sent home, of courage forged in steel and snow. The 1st Infantry Division did not seek glory, but they earned it. And in the great ledger of World War II, they stand among the giants. The 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, was no ordinary formation in the U.S. Army. These were the hardened veterans, the standard-bearers of American resolve. They weren't fresh recruits plucked from basic training or wide-eyed draftees tasting war for the first time. These were the men who had first seen combat in the sands of North Africa in 1942, under the unforgiving sun of Kasserine Pass, where hard lessons were paid for in blood. They had gone ashore again at Gela in Sicily, weathered the chaos of the hedgerows in Normandy, and climbed out of Higgins boats into the machine gun hell of Omaha Beach on D-Day. Many had lost friends by the dozens. Others bore scars hidden beneath their uniforms. Yet they pressed on. By December 1944, they had just come through the meat grinder of the Hurtgen forest. A month-long slog through dark, cold woods, filled with mines, booby traps, and relentless shell fire. It had been a campaign of attrition, one that seemed to sap the very soul from a soldier. Those who survived came out with hollow stares, their youth buried with the comrades they left behind under the thick canopy of pine. Now, after months of fighting and death, the division had finally been pulled back for a brief period of rest and refit near Aachen, Germany. It was not luxury they sought, just warmth, sleep, hot food, and perhaps a letter from home. Then, the world shook again. In the early dawn of December 16, 1944, German artillery and rocket fire shattered the frozen tranquility of the Ardennes. The news reached headquarters like a thunderclap. Entire American units had been overrun. The Germans, Hitler's last reserve of armor and experienced troops, had punched a hole nearly 80 miles wide through the Allied lines. It was a massive, audacious gamble. A desperate offensive designed to split the Allied armies, seize the port of Antwerp, and strangle the Allied supply lines. Panic flared along the front. Some American units broke and ran. Others were encircled or destroyed. What began as a controlled retreat quickly turned into chaos in sectors of the line. The icy roads became choked with vehicles, retreating troops, and civilians fleeing for their lives. Reports flowed in by the hour. Tiger tanks sighted here, SS troops spotted there, bridges destroyed, fuel dumps captured. It seemed as though the German Wehrmacht had risen from the ashes. In the eye of this storm, the call came from the very top. General Dwight D. Eisenhower himself, the Supreme Allied Commander, issued the orders. The 1st Infantry Division was to move immediately. Their mission: take position on the northern shoulder of the German Bulge, hold that ground, stop the breakthrough, no retreat, no surrender. It was a call only a unit like the Big Red One could answer. The men scrambled. Trucks were loaded in freezing dark. Some had been sleeping when the alert sounded, still bandaged from Hurtgen, boots barely dry from the last fight. Ammunition was counted, rations grabbed, weapons checked and rechecked. The cold was bitter, gnawing at fingers and faces like a living thing. Engines coughed to life, and long convoys began to snake their way toward the Ardennes, headlights blacked out, their breath rising like smoke signals into the frigid air. As they approached the front, the scenes that unfolded were grim. They passed units streaming in the opposite direction, shattered, demoralized remnants of once proud formations. "The Krauts are everywhere," some muttered. "It's a rout," said others. Snow-covered fields were littered with burnt-out tanks, abandoned gear, and the frozen dead. The roads were slick with ice and stained with oil and blood. But the big red one did not waver. They were to take up positions near the twin villages of Krinkelt and Rocherath, and further up the line, anchor the defense along the Elsenborn Ridge. This terrain was crucial. If the Germans could punch through here, they would gain access to the open plains of Belgium and potentially outflank the entire Allied front. It would be a dagger in the side of the Allied line, a possible road to the sea. The stakes could not have been higher. In the deep woods and ridges of the Ardennes, the 1st Infantry Division began digging in. In the ice-encrusted earth, they carved foxholes with frozen hands. Bazooka teams took up ambush positions. Machine guns were emplaced behind log-covered pits. Artillery observers climbed trees to spot for the gun crews. Men huddled in their winter coats, their breath fogging in the air, their fingers stiff and numb on rifle triggers. Snow muffled every sound but the distant rumble of tanks. And then the enemy came. SS Panzer Grenadiers moving through the trees with practiced precision. Panther tanks grinding through the narrow roads, mortars falling like thunder from above. The air stank of cordite and fear. But the men of the 1st didn't break. They had faced worse in North Africa, at Omaha, in the fields of France. Through blizzards and shellfire, they held the northern shoulder of the German advance. They endured freezing nights, constant probing attacks, and artillery barrages that turned forests into splintered wastelands. But they held. And with every hour they delayed the German thrust, they helped turn the tide. This was not glory. It was grit. It was mud and frostbite, and the quiet courage of men who had seen too much to be afraid. The line did not break, and because of that, the enemy never reached Antwerp. When the men of the 1st Infantry Division rolled into the Ardennes, they entered a frozen hell on earth. The wind howled through the pine-covered hills like a wolf in the night, sweeping snow across cratered roads and burying supply lines in white silence. Temperatures plummeted well below zero. Frost clung to faces and uniforms, creeping into bones. Snowdrifts swallowed foxholes overnight. It was the kind of cold that made metal burn flesh, where one wrong touch on a rifle's barrel could peel the skin off a man's hand. And into this nightmare came the steel beasts of the 1st SS Panzer Division, Hitler's spearhead. Veterans of the Eastern Front, clad in black uniforms and riding atop panthers and tigers, they were elite, brutal, and confident. Their goal was simple: smash through the American lines, seize the roads at Büllingen and Butgenbach, and push westward toward the Meuse. The 1st Infantry Division stood directly in their path. Between December 18th and Christmas Eve, 1944, the Big Red One endured one of its most grueling trials. It was not a grand, sweeping campaign, but a brutal, grinding stand, yard by yard, foxhole by foxhole, against overwhelming odds. The battlefield was an apocalyptic forest, scarred by shellfire and littered with the wreckage of burned-out tanks and shattered trees. In this frozen crucible, the American lines held firm not with numbers or firepower, but with sheer will. The tank ambush at Büllingen. It began with a thunderous roar, German tanks emerging from the early morning mist like steel monsters, black crosses gleaming on their flanks, engines growling in the cold. The 1st SS Panzer had seized the town of Büllingen and was pressing westward, confident in their momentum. But the Americans had dug in, and they had teeth. The 745th Tank Battalion, attached to the 1st Infantry Division, had positioned Sherman tanks in ambush positions along the snowy slopes and narrow village lanes. Camouflaged by pine branches and snowfall, they waited with barrels aimed low and steady. Then came the command: fire. The white landscape erupted in flame and thunder. Armor-piercing rounds slammed into the advancing Panthers and Tigers. 1, 2, then 5 tanks burst into flames. The Germans tried to maneuver, but the icy roads slowed them down. Some tanks slid into ditches. Others reversed into each other. American tank crews fought like demons, loading shells with frozen hands, ducking behind hatches as return fire screamed past. By day's end, 18 German tanks had been destroyed or disabled. Bulge was held, and the spear point of Hitler's counteroffensive had just been blunted. Holding the line at Dom-Bitgenbach northwest of Bulge, another storm was brewing. The town of Dom-Bitgenbach became the anchor of the American defense, a frozen crossroads surrounded by open fields and dense forest, perfect terrain for tanks and deadly for exposed infantry. The 26th Infantry Regiment, part of the 1st Infantry Division, dug in around the perimeter. There were no warm barracks here, no shelter from the elements. The foxholes were shallow, frozen, and often filled with snow. The men slept in shifts, huddled under tarps, their breath freezing on their collars. Medics wrapped wounds with numb fingers, knowing that a simple cut could turn fatal. Food was cold, water froze in canteens, and many men were down to their last dry pair of socks. Some couldn't feel their feet. Others would never feel them again. Then came the attack. German artillery pounded the town for hours, the concussions lifting men off the ground. Trees splintered into deadly spears. Then came the SS infantry, gray silhouettes moving through the fog, supported by tanks, flamethrowers, and machine guns. But the big red one did not yield. Machine gunners fired until their barrels glowed red. Riflemen held their positions, sometimes trading fire at distances of less than 50 yards. Bazooka teams crept through back alleys to strike enemy armor. At one point, a company of Americans was nearly surrounded. They fixed bayonets, fought hand-to-hand, and retook the ground. In the freezing dark, they shouted to each other across the fields, their words muffled by the storm. The enemy came again, and again. And each time, the line held. By December 23rd, the area around Dom-Bitgenbach resembled a battlefield from another world, scarred, burning, howling with the cries of wounded men and the thunder of guns. But the Germans had failed to break through. Christmas Eve. Miracle. Then, on the morning of December 24th, a miracle. The skies cleared. For over a week, the weather had grounded Allied aircraft, denying the Americans one of their greatest advantages. But now, under a brilliant winter sun, the roar of P-47 Thunderbolts and RAF Typhoons filled the air. They came in waves, strafing, bombing, chasing fleeing columns down frozen roads. German supply lines, so vital to sustaining the offensive, were reduced to flaming wrecks. Ammunition trucks exploded like firecrackers. Horse-drawn wagons were torn apart by cannon fire. For the men on the ground, cold, bloodied, exhausted, it was as if angels had descended from the sky. They cheered, wept, waved frozen helmets. A tank commander, crusted with snow and soot, was heard to murmur, "Now they'll pay." And the Germans did pay. Cut off from supply, unable to dislodge the Americans, and facing the full fury of Allied air power, the 1st SS Panzer Division began to falter. The panzers turned back. The infantry withdrew. The once mighty hammer of the Ardennes had struck, and the anvil of the big red one had held. While the 101st Airborne's stand at Bastogne became immortalized in headlines, war correspondence, and eventually Hollywood blockbusters, another story, less glamorous but no less heroic, was unfolding in the blizzard-swept north. It was not captured in movies or paratrooper legends, but it may very well have saved the Allied campaign in Western Europe. It was the story of the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, and their stubborn, unyielding stand at the northern shoulder of the Bulge. Where Bastogne was surrounded, the northern sector was where the Germans hoped to roll up the entire flank. The panzers were meant to break through Dom-Bütgenbach, sweep toward Malmedy, and punch open the roads to Liège and the Meuse. Had they succeeded, the entire Allied front would have been outflanked, possibly enveloped. But they didn't succeed, because the men of the 1st Infantry Division wouldn't let them. They were veterans, yes, but not just battle-worn. They were battle-forged. These were the same men who had bled in the desert heat of Kasserine, scaled the blood-soaked cliffs of Gela in Sicily, stormed the killing fields of Omaha Beach, and hacked through the mud and horror of the Hurtgen forest. They knew how to fight. They knew when to bend, when to dig in, and when to counterattack. And they knew how to endure, long after flesh gave out, and only will remained. By December 25th, what they had endured bordered on the inhuman. Some had fought for days with barely a few hours of sleep, sustaining themselves on frozen rations and cups of snow melted over campfires. Frostbite gnawed at toes and fingers. Bandages, once red and soaked, froze solid and crackled when touched. Ammunition was low, yet they counted every bullet, every shell, making each one count. At night, the sky glowed red from artillery, and during the day the sun brought no warmth, only clearer targets for the next attack. In Dom-Bütgenbach, Büllingen, and along the northern shoulder, entire platoons were reduced to squads. Company commanders took on the duties of sergeants, and privates became heroes without ceremony. Yet not a single German unit broke through. They had come so close, so perilously close. At times, the front lines were only yards apart. In the fog, German and American soldiers found themselves shooting at shadows or exchanging fire through shattered church windows and the husks of barns. Grenades were thrown underhand across ditches. At one point, a German officer, mistaking the confusion for victory, radioed Berlin that the northern flank was collapsing. It wasn't. It never did. Because the Big Red One held. Their stand was not just brave, it was decisive. Had they buckled, the German offensive could have ripped open the north, surrounded Allied divisions, and quite possibly reached the Meuse. The Battle of the Bulge might have become more than a temporary setback. It could have reversed the course of the war in Europe. Instead, the German tide crashed against them and broke. And yet, their victory came at a terrible cost. The casualty lists ran long. Thousands of soldiers from the 1st Infantry Division were killed, wounded, or frostbitten. Some died from their wounds, others died simply from the cold, found in the morning curled in foxholes, rifles still gripped in blue hands. Letters home never arrived. Christmas packages remained unopened. Whole families would hear only a knock at the door and the words, "We regret to inform you." But what they bought with their suffering was priceless: time, space, and momentum for the Allied cause. They had turned the tide of Hitler's last offensive with nothing more than grit, training, and courage. And they did it without fanfare. They weren't surrounded, so they never became the Alamo. There were no dramatic resupply missions, no isolated airfields, no famous general barking nuts at the enemy. Just soldiers, cold, weary, determined, doing their duty on a snowy ridgeline in Belgium. That's why history nearly forgot. But the truth is this: the Battle of the Bulge was not won in a single town or by a single unit. It was won across hundreds of villages and forests, by thousands of men like those of the 1st Infantry Division, each of them digging in, standing fast, and holding firm against the full weight of a desperate enemy offensive. Their stand at the northern shoulder of the Bulge was perhaps the least heralded but most critical act of the campaign. And in the end, it was their line that held, unbent, unbroken, while the Wehrmacht spent itself against their steel. So the next time the Battle of the Bulge is remembered, when the stories of Bastogne are told and the 101st is rightly honored, spare a thought for the big red one. For in the freezing woods near Büllingen and Dombütgenbach, they too made a stand, a quiet, brutal, and victorious stand that helped save the Western Front. And that too deserves to be remembered. A legacy that must never fade today. Most of the men who fought in the Bulge are gone, but their courage must never be forgotten. For veterans, if you served or had family who did, this story is part of your legacy. For families, many of those soldiers were just boys, 18, 19 years old, who gave everything for freedom. For history, the Battle of the Bulge was the bloodiest battle the U.S. Army fought in World War II, and the 1st Infantry Division was at the heart of it. Final salute, remembering the men who stood firm to the soldiers of the 1st Infantry Division. Thank you. To our viewers who remember this era, we honor your stories. Freedom was won in the frozen fields of Belgium by men who refused to retreat. End with a powerful image of 1st ID soldiers in the snow, fading into their insignia with the words, "No mission too difficult, no sacrifice too great, duty first."